highway leads to the shadowy tip of reality. You're on a through route to the land of the different, the bizarre, the unexplainable. Go as far as you like on this road. Its limits are only those of the mind itself. You're entering the wondrous dimensions of the imagination. Next stop, the Twilight Zone. This is the Corporal, age 21, a paratrooper who is secure in his own mortality, held together only by the thin thread of his memories. But in a few moments, a Japanese sniper bullet will hit him at the wrist and knee, bringing him into a reality that he's been trying to escape from since leaving Cayuga Lake. He'll be brought back to face an enemy he's never met, nor ever wanted to. His small-town upbringing and loving family will work against him. He can recall in detail a simpler, easier existence, which his wounds will erase from his life as if it never existed. The Corporal, demolitions expert, who in the next seconds will move into the Twilight Zone in a desperate search for survival. It was fast approaching when the oppressive heat of the day would be replaced by the oppressive humidity. The only good thing about the darkness was that the tracer rounds could be seen walking toward their positions, and the Japanese were proving to be an even tougher, more accurate, and certainly more tenacious foe than MacArthur had warned they would be. This was Leyte Island, in the Philippines, a place that the Corporal and the others in the 11th Airborne Division's 511th Parachute Regiment had come to hate and fear after only the first few days of the fierce battle that would never end. Except for the ones who bought it, and there were a lot of those. Too many of them. A heavy mortar round struck about 20 feet from where the Corporal and a half-dozen other paratroopers were hunkered down behind a jumble of boulders that looked as if they'd been dropped into the middle of the jungle. After the initial concussion, a rain of black dirt, chewed-up vegetation, and something else that smelled strongly of copper and something sweet and horribly sour at the same time fell down on them, peppering their helmets. A young man, even younger than the Corporal, and slighter and shorter than the Corporal's slender 5'4", suddenly leaped up and tried to run. His helmet, face, and shoulders were covered in blood, and a long twisted rope of intestine that had fallen from the sky was plastered down one arm from his shoulder to his elbow. He was screaming, his words not recognizable in the almost constant din of battle, because the noises coming from his throat were not human. Only the desperate sounds of a frantically frightened man. "Down!" the Corporal shouted. "Get down!" But the private didn't or couldn't hear. It was as if he had turned to run for home and nothing in the world could make him look back. Nothing would stop him until a Japanese Type 92 7.7mm machine gun round slammed into the back of his head, exiting out of the front of his helmet, and he was thrown forward onto his face, dead before he hit the ground. The Corporal, his mouth slightly open, knew that he shouldn't be affected by this. Just the latest death in the dozens, probably hundreds, that he had personally witnessed since New Guinea in June, but he had a vivid imagination. Ernie Pyle, or someone like that, he thought, had written something to the effect that a moron died only once, but a bright guy died 1,000 deaths because he could think out ahead and figure the odds, figure his chances. Probably had something to do with cowardice versus heroism, but right at this moment, the Corporal wanted to be anywhere but here, because he'd been figuring the odds for a long time. He hunkered down a little lower into the jungle mud and gore, into his own sweat and the foul body odors of the other grunts packed around him like untidy sardines in a can, and allowed his mind to drift into a fantasy world. Like the war in Leyte, the errant thought intruded in the corporal's head. The intense noises of the heavy machine gun fire and mortar rounds they were taking from the Japanese, who were steadily sending in reinforcements from Luzon, inescapable. He could see a man aboard a train, hurtling down a track somewhere back in the States. He was an ordinary man, maybe in some business that he'd grown tired of, a job and very likely a place from which he wanted to escape. The man was looking up at the conductor who'd come round to collect tickets, but it was clear from the expression on his face that he wasn't happy, that he might have wanted to take off into a dream world, that he'd be hurtling down some other track, for someplace else, for a place where he could be happy, could be at peace with himself. Maybe it would happen in his dreams. The corporal opened his eyes, and he could see pretty much the entire scene. The man was wishing for a better life, not in terms of money, but in terms of no stress, and he would fall asleep during his daily commute and dream of such a place. Small town, USA. Only on this day, he gets up in the middle of his dream and sleepwalks to the end of the passenger car, opens the door to the connecting platform, and then, without hesitation, with a smile on his face, opens the outer door and, still sleepwalking, steps off the speeding train to his death. Maybe it's wishful thinking nestled in the hidden part of a man's mind, or maybe it's the last stop in this vast design of things, or perhaps for this man it's a place around the bend where he could jump off. Someone was calling his name, but for a moment it didn't register. When his time came, he wouldn't jump up and try to run away, nor would he sleepwalk off a speeding train. It would be different for him. He knew it, could feel it in his gut. There was more for him, more life, more dreams, more everything.
Corporal, for Christ's sake, get your head out!
The corporal looked to the left, into the eyes of Tim Hafner, his squad sergeant, not 2 feet away. What? He said, but then he had to shout to be heard over the din.
What? That Jap pillbox is chewing us up. I'll try to find some defilade around the mound at 280. Come in from his blind side. I need covering fire.
The corporal looked out and saw the low mound of a hillock to the left. If the Sarge could reach that far, he'd be blocked from view by the Japanese gunners from their heavily fortified position. The others had looked up and were listening to the sergeant and nodding uncertainly. Fear was on their faces, but determination too. The only way this war was ever going to end was for them to take orders and to fight as hard as humanly possible. But the fog seemed to be everywhere, surrounding a man, making any future less than certain, even improbable. Their platoon of 2 squads, 8 guys and 1 sergeant in each, plus Lieutenant Henderson from Minnesota, was down to 1 undermanned squad, 1 sergeant, and no officer, with no replacements expected anytime soon.
Let's do it!
The Sarge motioned toward the hillock about 25 yards out. He hesitated a moment, then shouted,
Now!
The corporal popped up and began firing the M3 grease gun on full automatic, short bursts as they'd been taught. The other 4 grunts did the same, laying down a heavy screen of fire out ahead, walking the line up toward the machine gun slits in the Japanese position of palm logs and sandbags. The Sarge, a heavy-set man 10 years older than everyone else in the combined squad, had a potbelly, a fact everyone marveled at because all he'd been eating for the past 2 weeks were sea rats. And looking at him, no one would ever guess he could get to his feet from behind a boulder, let alone do a broken field run, in full kit, faster than any of the kids. But then incoming rounds, which had the right of way, were definite motivators. The Sarge, hunched behind the end of the mound of boulders, suddenly leaped forward, making a diagonal path toward the hill. He moved very fast, bent over at the waist, zigzagging through the sometimes thick jungle growth. Almost immediately, the Japs spotted him and moved their fire to the left, trying to cut him off. They knew what he was trying to do. The corporal increased his rate of fire, almost immediately running dry, but it took him only a couple of seconds to reload with a fresh 30-round box magazine of 45 ammo, slam the bolt back, then pop up again to fire. It was the same thing that everyone else was doing. Larry Peckstein pulled out a grenade, yanked the pin, and tossed it overhand to hit the ground within 10 or 15 yards of the pillbox, and it went off with an impressive bang. It hadn't caused any damage, yet the pop must have impressed the Japs because their fire diminished just as the Sarge flopped down behind the hummock, putting it between him and the pillbox. He gave the squad a thumbs up, and the corporal and the others hunkered down behind the boulders, and the Japanese machine guns opened up again on their position. From somewhere off to the right were a mortar launcher and a crew, and they began to lob round after round over the trees again, bracketing the squad's position. The corporal looked over at Peckstein, who was from somewhere near Jacksonville, he thought, and at the others, Yablonsky from Hackensack, Lamb from Waterloo, and Horvath from Cleveland, who'd claimed at one time or another to have owned just about every model Detroit had ever made before the war, and himself, of course, from Syracuse. 5 young men, soldiers all, Florida, New Jersey, Iowa, Ohio, and New York, with the usual backgrounds, all stuck in a situation beyond their making or understanding. There is no logic here, just a seemingly endless nightmare from which the only escape might be death. In the next second, we'll begin to see the situation for what it really is: the past, the present, and, more important to them, the future. A mortar round struck 10 yards to the left and slightly behind their position. Someone from the other side of the tall palm tree began returning fire, momentarily breaking the corporal out of his reveries. He cautiously raised up so that he could just see over the top of the boulders, but the Sarge was gone from behind the hill. Nowhere in sight, but then the machine gun fire from the pillbox concentrated on their position again, and he ducked back down. In his head, he could see the 5 of them desperately trying to get away, but none of them knew to where or what they might find if they got there. At first, they made a human pyramid, climbing on one another's shoulders, but they couldn't reach the top. Of the boulders? He didn't know. He couldn't see that far. Another mortar round landed nearby, and the corporal rose up again to look for the Sarge, but machine gun fire from the pillbox forced him back to his imagination. The 5 of them took off their web belts, linked them together, and attached a bayonet to one end, like a grappling hook. One of the soldiers, the corporal couldn't see who, but maybe it was himself because his need to escape was even stronger than the others, tossed the bayonet up over the top. 3 times before it finally caught on something, and he climbed over the top of the boulder and tumbled down to the other side, where he... The corporal opened his eyes again, confused in the first instant. He had escaped, in his mind, but he had no idea to where. He thought he might have seen snow. Perhaps he was lying face down, and when he looked up he'd been seeing something, perhaps a person, but not a Japanese soldier, and not the Sarge. Peckstein was looking at him, an odd expression on his red, freckled face smudged with grease and mud. "What?" the corporal asked.
You fall asleep or something? You okay?
It struck the corporal that the mortar shells had stopped coming, and the machine gun in the pillbox had gone silent. "What's going on? What's happening?"
Yeah, beats the shit out of me,
Peckstein said.
Maybe the Sarge got lucky.
The corporal rose up and took a quick look at the low hill and to the right, at the pillbox, but there was no movement, no sound. It was as if the 5 of them had dropped off the face of the earth, or at least out of the battlefield. Then a mortar round dropped so close in front of them that one of the larger boulders was dislodged and came tumbling down, missing Horvath by less than 1 foot. Then he had it, the place to which he had escaped by climbing up the boulders, and the figure. He was a doll, or something. The figure above him was that of a little girl, who picked him up and threw him back over the boulders, into a barrel with other dolls being collected for Christmas. Just a barrel where are kept make-believe figures made in the shapes of human beings, of soldiers unloved and in mortal danger for the moment. And somewhere just on the other side is a place of peace and home and love. If only they could get there, out of this dream world and into another. But the machine gun fire hadn't resumed, and the corporal chanced another look over the top. Nothing had changed. No sounds of gunfire anywhere, and now the mortar rounds stopped. He glanced down at Peckstein and the others, who were watching him.
"What do you see?"
Peckstein asked.
"Nothing." "What about the Sarge? Can you see him?"
Horvath asked.
"Has he made it to the pillbox?" "I told you there's nothing moving out there,"
the corporal said sharply. He was getting spooked. He'd been through lulls on the battlefield before, but never like this one, which seemed to have dropped over them like a thick blanket. He eased down and sat, his back against the boulders, his grease gun cradled between his knees.
"What are we supposed to do?"
Yablonsky asked. Like the others, he looked up to the corporal. "Wait for the Sarge," the corporal replied absently. He was thinking of something, his focus on the here and now going soft.
"But what if he doesn't come back? For Christ's sake, we can't sit here forever waiting for somebody to show up."
Here and now. The place is here on the battlefield. The time is now, mid-November 1944, and the journey is just about to start. But it isn't the jungle battlefield he's seeing with his mind's eye. It's a small town somewhere, maybe in the Midwest, and he can't remember his name or how he got there, except that the place seems to be deserted. Nothing moves, no sounds, not the rustling of the leaves in a breeze, not a child's laugh or a dog's bark. But people were here just a second ago. He walks into a diner on Main Street, and a burger is frying on the grill. A lit cigarette is perched on the edge of an ashtray. Across the street, he looks through the window of the barber shop and sees water dribbling from a faucet into the sink. He turns around and races up the street.
"No one's here!"
he shouts.
"Everyone's gone!"
Peckstein was there beside him, a wild look in his eyes.
"What the hell's the matter with you?"
"What do you mean?"
"You was shouting something crazy."
The corporal shook his head. He couldn't see the rest of it. The town, where the people had gone. The ending. But he desperately wanted to see, wanted to understand, because he felt that his life, his future, might depend on it. Something nagging at the back of his head, something from the future. Wonder stories he'd read as a boy, something just beyond his ken, wanting to take him away from this place, wanting to pull his concentration away from the struggle here to the mystery out there. Up there is an enemy known as isolation. It sits in the stars, waiting with the patience of eons. But he didn't know what that meant. The thoughts were merely random snippets, popping off in his head like a photographer's flashbulbs, clear for just an instant before nothing was left except the afterimage of a dark spot in the retina. Peckstein and the others were watching him. They were worried. With the Sarge gone, the corporal was all they had to lead them. He had a bachelor's degree from Antioch, which meant he knew things none of them knew. He could figure out stuff. They were depending on him.
"Well, at least they stopped shooting at us," the corporal said. "Do you think it's because of the Sarge?"
Horvath asked.
"Maybe he took out the pillbox."
"We would have heard something," Lamb said. He was the shy one of the squad and usually the butt of the jokes. But what he just said made sense, and no one ribbed him. They would have heard the Sarge's grease gun, or maybe a grenade. But nothing. And now this ominous silence. The corporal peered over the top of the boulders again, but still there was no sign of the Sarge.
"Anything?"
Peckstein asked. The corporal dropped back down and shook his head.
"We'll give him a couple more minutes."
"Then what?" "We'll see," the corporal said, and suddenly he remembered something in the face of the young private who tried to run away and gotten himself killed. It was a momentary flash of light, the sun streaming through the palm fronds ruffling in the breeze. But he'd had the strangest sensation that he knew the kid was going to buy it. U.S. Army paratroopers, Philippine Islands, gathered behind a pile of boulders in the middle of the jungle. Their sweating faces are covered in mud and grime and blood, their eyes wide with a curious mix of fear and resignation. Some of them will die, and all of them know it. though no one is sure who'll be next, except perhaps for one man who can see the light. He could see the story in his head, visualize the men, Peckstein and Lamb and the others. He could even hear himself telling the Sarge, and later an officer in the rear, that he could see death. It was the light on their faces. They didn't believe him, and the more he tried to convince them that he had this terrible gift, the more they pushed him away, sending him back to the front. "Why don't you look in the mirror?" someone suggested. And he remembered a line he'd read at Antioch from Shakespeare's Richard III. "He has come to open the purple testament of bleeding war." In his imagination, they were calling him a nutcase, and here and now he was beginning to wonder if it was true. He was seeing things, hearing things, trying to step off the speeding train. The private wanted to go home. The businessman just wanted peace, and the corporal wanted the same things. He looked up into the sky, the sun low now off to the right, and thought for a moment that he'd heard the engines of an airplane. The Navy was flying air cover, but just not here today. Anyway, the plane sounded too big to operate off an aircraft carrier, and they were too far from Australia for land-based planes. It didn't make any sense to the corporal. He looked over the boulders toward the hillock and then the pillbox. The Sarge was gone, and it was up to him to make the decision. "Check your ammo," he told them. "We're going in the same way the Sarge did." "Jesus," Leblonsky said, but they hurriedly did as they'd been instructed. "I'm down to 2 magazines, Lamb said. "I only have 2 grenades, Peckstein told him. The corporal had 5 grenades and 5 magazines of ammo, plus the half-empty one in his weapon, which he swapped out for a full one. "Lamb, strip the bodies," he ordered. "Horvath, you and the rest of your guys help him. We're going in with as much firepower as we can carry." They nodded, their eyes wide, and hurried off to do as they'd been ordered, their fear no less than before, but with a sense of relief that they were going to be doing something. They had an objective. The corporal thought he heard the airplane again, maybe above the clouds, circling, searching for something, maybe for a way down. Unknown to the pilot and his crew, this airplane is heading into an uncharted region well off the beaten path, perhaps on an odyssey, perhaps reported overdue and missing by now, the object of a frantic search on land and especially in the sea, an Army Air Corps plane trying to get home. But we know where she is, and maybe we should shoot up a flare or something. "Who goes first?" Peckstein was saying, and the corporal looked at him and the others blankly for just an instant. The battlefield continued to be silent and eerie, and the corporal got the strong impression that he and his 4 squad mates were the last people on the planet. Even the plane circling overhead was gone. "I'll go first," he said, "but spread out, left and right. Keep low and keep firing." "Grenades?" Horvath asked. "Save them until later," the corporal said. "Look, it's only 25 yards and we'll have a defilade." "Unless the Sarge is dead and we run into a trap," Peckstein suggested. "Could be that's just what they want us to do. They stop shooting and like a bunch of saps, we run right out there into an ambush." The corporal ignored him, looked up over the top of the boulders one last time. Still no movement. "Let's go," he said. Without looking over his shoulder to make sure the others were with him, he started running, half bent over at the waist, his legs pumping, and he began firing short bursts towards the pillbox. Almost immediately, Peckstein and the others opened fire. The corporal had another crazy thought. What if he could invent a time machine to go back to just before the Japs manning the pillbox had been inducted into the service and kill them? They wouldn't be here now. The sergeant's body lay sprawled on the west side of the hillock, most of the front of his head blown away. He couldn't be seen from behind the boulders. The corporal started to turn when the sniper's bullet hit his wrist, fragmented, and the pieces slammed into his knee, knocking him to the ground. Peckstein and the others were firing, and one of the guys started lobbing grenades over the hill, all of it to stop action at the corporal's head. He heard the airplane again, only this time there were 2 of them, small, fighters from off the aircraft carriers, come to the rescue. Someone, Horvath or perhaps Lamb or perhaps both of them, dragged him to the safety of the hillock, and as he phased in and out of consciousness, he realized that if he didn't die here, in this place, today, in the island jungle twilight, he would be going home. Heckstein loomed above, a big grin in his face.
"Serling, can you hear me?" he said. "Listen, Rod, you're going to be okay. You just got your $1 million wound."
Horvath was there too, smiling like a kid at a birthday.
"Yeah, we're going home."
He shook his head.
"I'm going to miss your stories."
Lying wounded in the Leyte jungle, Corporal Rod Serling has his strangest thought of the day. There is a fifth dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space, and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area that might be called the Twilight Zone.